The welcome basket felt heavy in my hands, but not from the homemade bread or the jar of blackberry jam. It was the weight of the rules. The same rules my parents followed without question, their lives governed by the quiet traditions of this place. Now they were gone, and the task fell to me. I was supposed to give this to the new couple, the ones who thought they'd found paradise. They laughed when they read the list. That was a week ago. Tonight their house is dark. Their front door hangs open to the night, and the only sound is a phantom ringing in my ears. They broke the rules. There's a specific kind of silence that blankets the Appalachian hills, the kind you don't just hear, but feel in your bones. It's a heavy, ancient quiet that presses in from all sides, thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and pine. I'd forgotten its weight in the 10 years I was away. Now, it was my constant companion. I returned to Havenwood Gap not out of choice but out of necessity. My parents' car, a sensible old sedan they'd had for ages, had met a patch of black ice on the winding mountain road that served as the town's only artery to the outside world. Just like that, I was an orphan at 28, and the sole heir to a house that held more ghosts than furniture. The house itself was a testament to Appalachian persistence. Built by my great-grandfather from timber hewn from this very land, it stood on a small rise overlooking a deep, fog-choked valley. Its wooden bones groaned and settled with the changing temperatures, each creak and pop a familiar sound from my childhood. Unpacking the boxes felt like an archaeological dig through my own life. Old photographs of my parents, young and smiling on the porch where I now sat, my father's collection of whittled birds, my mother's worn-out gardening gloves, still holding the faint shape of her hands. Each object was a fresh stab of grief, a reminder of the silence that now filled the rooms they once inhabited. Havenwood Gap isn't a place people move to, it's a place people are from. A tight-knit community of a few hundred souls connected by blood, history, and a shared, unspoken understanding of the land. We have one general store, one gas station, and a church whose steeple had been struck by lightning so many times it was now just a jagged stump pointing accusingly at the sky. Outsiders were a rarity, usually just leaf peepers in the fall who would buy some apple butter and move on. So when the old Miller cabin at the end of my road was sold, the news traveled through town like a current. The buyers were a young couple from Charlotte named Mark and Sarah Clark. They were the epitome of city dwellers seeking a romantic, rustic escape. They had a shiny new SUV, expensive hiking gear they didn't know how to use, and a boundless, almost painful optimism. I met them a few days after they moved in. I was trying to tame the wild honeysuckle that was threatening to swallow my mailbox when their SUV pulled up. "You must be our new neighbor," Sarah said, leaning out of the passenger window with a smile that was blindingly white. Mark got out, extending a hand. He was tall with a tech bro haircut and a friendly, if slightly condescending, demeanor. "Mark Clark," he said, "and this is Sarah. We're so excited to be here. The peace and quiet are just unreal." I shook his hand. "Liam, welcome to the Gap." "Liam?" "Right. The realtor mentioned you," Sarah said. "We're just so thrilled. We're planning on starting a huge organic garden, maybe getting some chickens. Really get back to nature, you know?" I knew they saw the postcard version of this place, the majestic rolling hills, the vibrant sunsets, the quaint simplicity. They didn't see the isolation, the crushing poverty that hid just beneath the surface, or the way the woods seemed to watch you, to know you. They didn't understand the silence, not yet. A week later, Mr. Abernathy found me. He was the town's unofficial elder, a man who looked like he'd been carved from the same ancient wood as my house. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, and his eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, seemed to hold the long memory of the mountains themselves. He found me on my porch, trying to repair a rotted step. "Liam," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He didn't bother with pleasantries. People in Havenwood Gap rarely did. He was holding a wicker basket. "The town thought it'd be right for you to give this to the new folks, seeing as you're the closest." He handed it to me. It was heavier than it looked. Inside, nestled in a checkered cloth, was a loaf of fresh sourdough, a mason jar of what looked like my mother's blackberry jam recipe, and a small, folded piece of paper. The paper was yellowed with age, brittle at the creases. It's important they get this, Mr. Abernathy said, his gaze fixed on me. There was no warmth in it, only a stark, unwavering intensity. Make sure they read it. He turned and walked away without another word, his boots making soft, rhythmic thuds on the dirt path. The walk to the clerk's cabin was short, maybe a quarter of a mile down the winding dirt road that serviced our properties. The trees pressed in close on either side, their branches interlocking overhead to form a dense canopy that plunged the road into a perpetual twilight, even in the middle of the day. The air grew cooler here, the silence deeper. I could hear the scuttling of unseen things in the undergrowth. I found Mark in his yard, wrestling with a new lawnmower that refused to start. He was sweating, his face flushed with frustration. He brightened when he saw me. "Liam, hey man, don't suppose you know anything about these infernal machines?" he grunted, giving the pull cord another useless yank. "Sometimes they just need a little coaxing," I said, offering a non-committal smile. "Brought you something, a welcome gift from the town." I handed him the basket. Sarah came out of the cabin, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her cheerful energy felt alien in the oppressive quiet of the woods. "Oh, how sweet! Is that sourdough?" she exclaimed, peering into the basket. "And jam! Mark, look!" As she lifted the jam, the folded piece of paper fluttered to the ground. I bent to pick it up, the strange texture of the old parchment-like paper cool against my fingers. I handed it to her. "This was in there too. Mr. Abernathy said it was important." Sarah unfolded it carefully. Mark leaned over her shoulder to read. I already knew what it said. I'd seen a copy once, tucked away in my father's desk drawer when I was a boy. They were the Havenwood Gap Hospitality Rules. Sarah began to read them aloud, her voice laced with a growing amusement. Rule 1. Do not leave any exterior lights on between the hours of midnight and sunrise. She looked at Mark and chuckled. Saving on the electric bill, I guess. Rule 2, she continued. Any music played outdoors must cease at twilight. She raised an eyebrow. I guess our evening barbecues will be pretty quiet. Rule 3. Never under any circumstances answer if you hear your name called from the woods. This time she laughed outright. A bright, sharp sound that seemed to fall flat in the dense air. Okay, that's a little creepy. Is this some kind of local hazing ritual? I felt a strange knot tighten in my stomach. It's just old superstitions, I guess. This is a very old place. Mark took the paper from her. His tone was mocking. Rule 4. If you find a door to your house standing open when you know you closed it, do not enter. Go immediately to the church and wait for sunrise. The church doesn't even have a roof. And my personal favorite, Sarah chimed in, pointing at the last line. Rule 5. Ignore the bells. We no longer have a bell ringer. She shook her head, still smiling. Well, thank you, Liam. It's quaint. Really. We appreciate the welcome. They saw it as a joke, a charming piece of local folklore. I tried to see it that way too. I mumbled something about getting back to my porch repair and made my retreat, feeling like a fool. As I walked away, I could hear their laughter echoing behind me, a foreign sound that the ancient trees seemed to drink up without a trace. I should have said more. I should have told them that Mr. Abernathy doesn't tell jokes, that no one in Havenwood Gap does. I should have told them that my father, a man of logic and reason, had followed these rules religiously. But I didn't. I just kept walking, the silence of the woods rushing in to reclaim the space their laughter had briefly occupied. For a week, everything was deceptively normal. I saw the Clarks a few times working in their yard. They waved, I waved back. I was starting to believe that maybe the rules were just a relic, a harmless eccentricity. Maybe the suffocating feeling I'd had since returning was just grief playing tricks on my mind. I wanted to believe that. Then came last night. I was sitting on my porch, watching the sun bleed out behind the western ridge. The sky was a stunning canvas of bruised purples and fiery oranges. The cicadas had started their nightly chorus, a pulsating thrum that was the true sound of an Appalachian evening. And then another sound intruded. It was music. It was coming from the Clark's cabin, some kind of indie rock band, with a thumping bass line and a singer's plaintive voice carrying clearly through the still air. I glanced at the sky. The last sliver of sun had already disappeared. Twilight was over. Darkness was settling into the valley like a pooling liquid. They were breaking rule number 2. My first instinct was to walk over there, to tell them to turn it off. The intensity of the urge surprised me. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but then what? What would I say? "Hey guys, you have to turn off your music because an old piece of paper told you to." They'd think I was insane. I'd be the crazy mountain hermit they'd tell their city friends about. So I stayed put, my knuckles white on the armrests of my chair. I told myself it didn't matter. It was just a silly rule. I went inside, but I couldn't settle. The music was a constant, invasive presence. It was wrong. Every instinct I had, every lesson this place had ever taught me, screamed that the music was a violation. It was a loud, defiant declaration of their presence, a challenge to the profound silence that was supposed to own the night. I tried to read, but the bass vibrated faintly through the floorboards of my old house. I tried to watch TV, but the sound felt thin and hollow compared to the intrusion from outside. Eventually, around 11, I gave up and went to bed, pulling a pillow over my head to muffle the noise. Sleep, when it finally came, was restless and shallow, filled with fractured dreams of dark woods and calling voices. I was ripped from it by a sound that was not a dream. It was the sound of a bell. My eyes snapped open. The music from the Clark's cabin was gone. The house was utterly silent, save for my own ragged breathing. I sat up, listening. There it was again, a single, resonant dong. It wasn't the clean, melodic chime of a proper church bell. This was a cracked, dissonant sound, thick with age and disuse, as if a great iron throat were groaning in pain. It came from the direction of the old, ruined church deep in the woods. Dong. A pause long enough to make you think it was over. Then again. Dong. Rule number 5 echoed in my mind, a frantic whisper in the sudden, terrifying silence. Ignore the bells. We no longer have a bell ringer. My blood ran cold. The cicadas had stopped. The night was utterly, unnaturally still. The silence now was different. It wasn't the peaceful, living silence of the mountains I knew. This was a dead silence, a vacuum. It was the silence of something holding its breath, listening. I crept out of bed and went to the window that faced the Clark's property. Their cabin, which should have had a warm, welcoming light on, was a black silhouette against the slightly less black sky. It was completely dark. But that wasn't what made my breath catch in my throat. The front door was open. Not just ajar, but wide open, a gaping black mouth that had swallowed the cheerful, optimistic couple I'd met just a week ago. The tolling continued, slow, deliberate, and final. Dong, dong, dong. Each note seemed to shake the very air, a funeral dirge for two people who had thought they'd found paradise. They just didn't read the rules. I'm standing at my window now, staring into that darkness. The sound of the phantom bells burned into my memory. I don't know what that silence after their music stopped meant, but the fear is the most real thing I've ever felt. If you want to find out what happened next, what I saw in that cabin when the sun finally rose, you have to follow my story. Subscribe to this channel and hit the like button to let me know you're out there with me watching the darkness, because I don't think I can face it alone. Sleep was not an option. The dawn came not as a comfort, but as an accuser. A weak, watery light bleeding reluctantly over the eastern ridgeline to illuminate the scene of a crime I couldn't define. Every nerve in my body was a live wire, humming with a sleepless, adrenaline-fueled dread. The phantom tolling of the bell had ceased with the first hint of morning, but the sound was imprinted on the inside of my skull, a permanent, dissonant chord. The silence that remained was somehow worse. It felt expectant. I spent hours at the window, watching the Clark's cabin as the world turned from charcoal gray to a pale, washed-out blue. The open door was a void, a flagrant violation of the natural order of things. Doors are meant to be closed at night. They are the barrier between the safe and the unknown. This one was an invitation. By the time the sun had fully cleared the trees, casting long, distorted shadows across the overgrown yard, I knew I couldn't just stand there. My fear was a physical thing, a cold, heavy stone in my gut, but the gnawing uncertainty was worse. I had to do something. Remembering the 4th rule, however, was like a leash pulling me taut. If you find a door to your house standing open, do not enter. It wasn't my house, but the principle felt terrifyingly universal. So I didn't enter. I pulled on my boots, my hands trembling so badly it took 3 tries to tie the laces, and walked down the dirt road. The morning air was sharp and cold, carrying the familiar sense of wet stone and pine, but today they felt alien, hostile. As I approached the cabin, I stayed on the road, circling the property from a distance. Everything looked terrifyingly normal. Their shiny SUV was still parked where it had been for a week, dew clinging to its metallic paint. A child's swing mark had hung from a thick oak branch, stirred slightly in the morning breeze. From my vantage point, I could see through the open doorway into their living room. A ceramic mug with a cheerful cartoon cat on it sat on the coffee table, a dark ring of condensation still visible on the polished wood beneath it. A laptop was open next to it, its screen dark. It was a scene of domesticity frozen mid-moment, as if the occupants had simply evaporated into thin air. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass, just a sudden, absolute absence. The wrongness of it was a physical pressure against my chest. This wasn't a departure, it was an erasure. My duty as a neighbor, as a decent human being, was clear. I retreated to my own house, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, and called Sheriff Collier. The phone rang 5 times before he picked up, his voice thick with sleep. "Collier. Sheriff, it's Liam Henderson, over on Ridge Road." There was a pause, then a tired sigh. "Liam, it's barely 7 in the morning. What's the trouble?" I explained everything, my voice strained and quiet, trying to keep the hysteria at bay. I told him about the music, the sudden silence, the bells and the open door. I told him the Clarks were gone. I waited for the alarm in his voice, the urgency. It never came. "All right, son," he said, his tone infuriatingly calm. "I'll be up there in a bit. You just sit tight. And Liam, don't go in that house. You hear me?" He said it not like a command to preserve a crime scene, but like a weary father reminding a child not to touch a hot stove. It was the same tone Mr. Abernathy had used, the tone of someone who knew the rules. An hour later, Collier's cruiser lumbered up the road. He was a heavy man, the buttons on his uniform shirt straining against his belly. His face, etched with the same deep lines as the other old-timers in the Gap, looked permanently tired. He didn't bother with a siren or lights. He got out of his car with a grunt and surveyed the scene, his eyes lingering on the open door for a long moment. "Stay here," he ordered, and walked into the cabin. He was inside for no more than 5 minutes. When he emerged, his expression was unchanged. "Well?" I demanded, my voice tight. "Nothing," he said, taking off his hat and wiping his brow. "House is empty. Looks like they packed a bag or 2 and took off." "Packed a bag? Sheriff, their car is right there. Their coffee is on the table. They didn't go anywhere." Collier put his hat back on, adjusting it slowly. "Listen, Liam. City folks. They're a different breed. They come up here thinking it's all peace and quiet. But the quiet gets to them, the dark. They get spooked by a raccoon scratching at the door and decide they ain't cut out for it. Seen it 100 times. They probably got a friend to pick them up in the middle of the night. They'll call for the car in a week or 2. It was the weakest, most transparent lie I had ever heard. He was feeding me a pre-written script. "And the bells?" I pressed, my voice rising. "What about the bells?" I heard. He stared at me, his gaze flat and unreadable. "Old mine shafts all through these hills, son. Wind gets in them just right, makes all sorts of strange noises. You've been gone a while. Maybe you just forgot the sounds of this place." He wasn't just dismissing me, he was gaslighting me, trying to make me believe my own senses were faulty. He closed the cabin door, the click of the latch echoing in the morning stillness, and produced a roll of yellow tape from his trunk, stringing a single lazy strand across the doorway. It was a perfunctory gesture, a performance for my benefit. "I'll make a few calls, file a report," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. The gesture was meant to be reassuring, but felt like a warning. "You get back to your unpacking. Don't you worry about the Clarks." Watching him drive away, I was overcome by a profound and terrifying sense of isolation. I wasn't just alone in my grief anymore. I was alone in reality. The entire town, it seemed, was committed to a shared delusion, and I was the only one not reading from the script. Later that day, Driven by a need for supplies and a desperate desire to see a normal human face, I drove into the town's small center. The general store was the hub of Havenwood Gap, a dim, cluttered space that smelled of sawdust, coffee, and old secrets. Martha, who had run the store since before I was born, was behind the counter. Her smile was a fixture, as much a part of the store as the antique cash register. "Liam, honey, good to see you," she said, her voice warm. "Need to restock the pantry?" "Just a few things, Martha," I said, grabbing a carton of milk and some bread. I hesitated, then forced myself to ask, "You hear anything about those new folks, the Clarks, up by my place?" The change was instantaneous and chilling. Her smile didn't vanish, it curdled. The light in her eyes went out, replaced by something flat and hard as river stones. "Some people just aren't suited for mountain life," she said, her voice losing all its warmth. She refused to meet my gaze, focusing instead on ringing up my items with brisk, angry movements. "It takes a certain kind of person to appreciate the quiet." There it was again. The same sentiment, almost the exact same words as the sheriff. It was a catechism, a lie they had all agreed upon. The air in the store suddenly felt thick, unbreathable. I paid for my things and left, the weight of the town's collective silence pressing down on me. I was the outsider now. I had asked the wrong question. Back at the house, paranoia began to take root. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside sounded like a threat. The woods that had been a comfort in my youth now felt like a wall of silent, watching eyes. I realized that if I wanted answers, I couldn't rely on anyone here. I would have to find them myself. My father had been a man of history, a high school teacher who kept meticulous records. I hoped he might have kept something about the town's peculiarities. I spent the afternoon in his dusty office, going through old file cabinets and boxes. I found tax records, old report cards, and photo albums, but nothing about any rules. Then I found his journals. They were mostly filled with mundane observations about the weather and his garden, but one entry from about 15 years ago stood out. Another outsider gone. The Hendersons from Ohio, left in the middle of the night, Collier said, didn't even take their dog. People just don't understand the quiet. The same phrase, the same excuse, and the chilling detail about the dog. This had been happening for years. It was a pattern. My investigation led me to the town hall the next day, a small brick building that housed the clerk's office, and in a damp, musty back room, the town archives. I told the clerk I was doing some genealogical research on my family. She bought it, leaving me alone in the cramped room with towering shelves of ledgers and boxes of old newspapers. The air was thick with the scent of dust and brittle paper, the sweet, faint smell of decay. For hours, I sifted through old copies of the Havenwood County Chronicle, a weekly paper that seemed to run the same 3 stories on rotation: the high school football game, the prize-winning pumpkin at the county fair, and the church bake sale. But as I dug deeper back into the 80s, the 70s, the 60s, I found the pattern. It was never a front-page story. It was always a small column on the back pages. A new family who had bought a property for a song would be mentioned. A few months later, a brief, sterile notice would appear. The Miller family has moved on to pursue opportunities elsewhere. Their property is once again on the market. Sometimes it was a single person, a writer or an artist seeking solitude. They too would move on without a trace. The town wasn't just hiding the disappearances, they were facilitating them. They were reselling the properties, resetting the board for the next players. We weren't a community, we were a trap. Exhausted and more unnerved than ever, I returned home as dusk was settling. The light was failing, the world turning to shades of grey and deep purple. I still had chores to do, a life to maintain, so I went to the woodshed at the edge of my property to chop some kindling for the fireplace. The rhythmic thwack of the axe against the wood was a small, reassuring sound in the encroaching stillness. The air grew cold. The woods before me were a solid wall of impenetrable blackness. I raised the axe for another swing when I heard it. It was a voice, my mother's voice. It wasn't a memory or a trick of the wind. It was her voice, clear as day, imbued with all the warmth and love I remembered so vividly it felt like a physical blow. It wasn't a shout or a whisper. It was conversational, calm, and impossibly close, as if she were standing right on the other side of the tree line. "Liam," she called, her voice full of gentle concern. "Honey, are you coming in for supper? It's getting late." I froze, the axe heavy in my hands. My heart stopped. My blood turned to ice. It was a call I had heard 1,000 times as a child, playing in these very woods. It was the sound of safety, of home, of love. And it was coming from the pitch-black maw of the forest. Rule number 3. Never, under any circumstances, answer if you hear your name called from the woods. The thing out there, the presence that had taken the Clarks, knew me. It had sifted through my memories, found my most vulnerable, tender-hearted spot, and was now pressing on it with surgical precision. It was using my own love, my own grief, as a lure. I stood there, paralyzed, every fiber of my being screaming to answer, to run towards the sound of the person I missed more than life itself. But the rule held me fast. The terror was greater than the longing. I didn't answer. I just stood there, shaking in the dark, as the silence rushed back in, more profound and more predatory than ever before. It knew my name, and it was learning my heart. The axe remained where I had dropped it, a dark shape slowly vanishing into the deep, damp grass at the edge of the woods. For 2 days it lay there, a monument to my paralysis. I didn't dare retrieve it. The tree line had ceased to be a simple boundary between my property and the forest. It was now a membrane, a permeable veil between my world and something else. Something that knew my mother's voice. Sleep had become a foreign country I could no longer visit. I subsisted on stale coffee and a gnawing visceral fear that had taken up permanent residence in my stomach. I had barricaded the doors at night, wedging old chairs under the knobs, a gesture I knew was pathetically futile. If a locked door hadn't protected the Clarks, a piece of oak furniture wouldn't protect me. The house was no longer a refuge. It was a cage where I was the sole exhibit. The familiar groans of the old structure were no longer comforting. Each sound was a potential footstep, a prelude to a voice calling my name from the hallway. This limbic state of constant, high-alert terror was unsustainable. My sanity was fraying, shredding itself against the whetstone of uncertainty. I knew I had 2 choices. I could succumb to the paralysis, sit here and wait for the bells to toll for me, or I could move. I could force the confrontation. The voice from the woods, the town's suffocating conspiracy of silence, the phantom bell, they were all threads leading back to one place. The source of the sound, the origin of the 5th rule, the ruined church. The decision, when it finally solidified in my mind, felt less like an act of courage and more like the last desperate move in a game I was destined to lose. On the 3rd morning, under a sky the color of slate, I left my house and walked not towards the town, but deeper into the woods, towards the jagged, broken steeple I could just make out through the dense canopy. The old path to the church was almost completely reclaimed by nature. Thorned vines snagged at my clothes, and my boots sank into a thick carpet of moss and mud. The air here was different, cooler, heavier, with the mineral tang of decay. The woods grew unnervingly quiet as I walked, the typical chatter of birds and insects fading away until the only sounds were my own ragged breathing and the snapping of twigs under my feet. It felt like trespassing. The trees, ancient and gnarled, seemed to lean in, their branches like crooked fingers, passing judgment on my intrusion. After a 20-minute walk that felt like an hour, I saw it. The church was a skeleton picked clean by time and neglect. The steeple, the part I could see from my house, was a splintered spear of wood aimed at the heavens. Most of the roof had collapsed inward, leaving the nave open to the sky. Stained glass windows were now just gaping holes, their once vibrant colors reduced to a few jagged shards of ruby and cobalt, clinging stubbornly to the warped lead frames. A large oak tree had grown up through the floor where the altar once stood, its branches reaching through the ruined roof like a supplicant's arms. I pushed open one of the heavy oak doors, which groaned in protest, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound silence. Inside, the scene was one of beautiful desolation. Pews lay overturned, covered in a verdant blanket of moss. Sunlight filtered through the thick canopy above, streamed down in dusty, cathedral-like shafts, illuminating patches of the debris-strewn floor. It was a place of forgotten faith, a temple surrendered to a much older, wilder god. My eyes were drawn upward to the bell tower. Against all odds, the bell was still there, a massive dark bronze shape suspended in the gloom. It was coated in a thick layer of verdigris, and I could see a significant jagged crack running down its side, the source of the dissonant, broken tone I'd heard. Seeing it was a strange, paradoxical moment of relief and terror. It proved I wasn't going mad. The bell was real, but that meant the ringing was real too, and the bell ringer was a ghost. I spent the better part of an hour exploring the ruins, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. I was looking for something, anything, a clue that would lend sense to the madness. I found hymnals swollen and fused together by damp, their pages a solid block of moldy paper. I found the shattered remains of the pulpit. Nothing. Defeated, I was about to leave when my foot caught on a loose floorboard near the base of the altar tree. I stumbled, catching myself on a dilapidated pew. Cursing, I looked down to see what I'd tripped on. One of the thick oak planks was raised a few inches higher than the others. Curiosity, or perhaps some deeper instinct, overrode my fear. I knelt down, the damp wood soaking through the knees of my jeans, and pried at the board with my fingers. It was stubborn, but decades of rot had weakened its moorings. With a final, splintering groan, it came loose. Beneath it was a small dark cavity, a man-made hollow lined with what looked like oilcloth to protect it from the damp. And nestled inside was a single object, a thick, leather-bound book. It was a ledger of some kind, its cover stamped with a simple faded gold cross. It felt cool and heavy in my hands. The leather was cracked with age, but it was remarkably well preserved. I sat on the steps of the ruined altar, the silence of the dead church my only witness, and opened the book. The first page read, in elegant spidery cursive, property of the Havenwood Gap Parish, records and notations by Sacristan Elias Thorne, Anno Domini 1888. It wasn't a record of baptisms or marriages. It was a journal, a secret history of the town. My hands shook as I turned the brittle yellowed pages, my eyes scanning the meticulous, frantic script. October 12th, 1888. The first frost came early this year. The harvest was poor. The congregation of the wood grows restless. We have not provided a tithe since the railroad surveyor vanished last spring. The old pact phrase, the whispers have returned on the wind at night. God forgive us, but we must find another. My blood ran cold. Congregation of the wood, the tithe. This was no simple superstition. This was a system, a pact. I kept reading, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. April 7th, 1891. A family from Pennsylvania has purchased the old Jennings homestead. They speak of starting a new life. They are loud. Their laughter echoes in the valley. They play a pianoforte on their porch in the evenings. They do not understand that certain sounds are a summons. They are ringing a bell for a supper to which they are the main course. I delivered the traditional welcome and the rules of hospitality. They thanked me, and I saw in their eyes they believed it to be charming local folklore. They will not last the season. The sacristan's words were a cold, dead echo of my own experience with the Clarks. The rules weren't a warning to protect outsiders. They were a test, a way to identify those who were not initiated, those whose noise would draw the attention of this entity. I flipped through the pages, a century of quiet horror chronicled in Thorne's elegant hand. He wrote of the entity as an ancient terrestrial intelligence, something that had been in these hills long before the first settlers arrived. It did not hunt with claws or fangs, but with mimicry and psychological warfare. July 22nd, 1903. It has learned another voice. Young Mr. Abernathy, grandfather to our current Abernathy, I realized with a jolt, told me it called to the new candlemaker using the sound of his wife's weeping. The poor man ran into the woods without a second thought. We found his hat near the creek bed 2 days later. That was all. The open door is its signal of a successful harvest. It is a sign that the tithe has been paid and the rest of us are safe for a time. And then I found the entry that made me stop breathing. May 16th, 1924. I grow old. My hand trembles as I write this. Last night, for the first time, I heard the great bell toll on its own. It was not the wind. It was a slow, deliberate ringing, a celebration. It has learned to use our most sacred instrument to announce its profane feasts. The bell is no longer God's voice. It belongs to the wood now. We must tell the children to ignore it, lest they think it a call to prayer. There it was, the horrifying context for every rule. The lights and music were a summons. The voices were a lure. The open door was a tombstone, and the bells were a victory cry. We weren't a community hiding from a monster. We were its keepers, its flock, culling the herd to ensure our own survival. Armed with this terrifying new knowledge, my fear was transmuted into a white-hot, desperate rage. The town's silence wasn't born of ignorance. It was the calculated silence of complicity. I clutched the sacristan's journal to my chest and ran from the church, back through the oppressive woods, my mind racing. I had to confront them. I had to make them acknowledge what they were doing. I didn't even go back to my house. I got in my car, the century-old journal lying on the passenger seat like a bomb, and drove straight to the sheriff's office. I slammed the door open, finding Collier sitting at his desk, nursing a cup of coffee. He looked up, his expression of mild annoyance quickly hardening when he saw the look on my face and the book in my hand. "Collier, we need to talk," I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of fear and fury. I threw the journal onto his desk. "I know everything." He didn't even flinch. He looked at the book, then back at me, his eyes cold and flat. "You've been trespassing, Liam. Stirring up things that ought to be left alone." "Stirring up things? People are dying. The Clarks moved on," he interrupted, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Just like the Hendersons from Ohio, just like the candle maker in this book, and a dozen others you probably read about. It's the price of peace." "Price? You're sacrificing people," I yelled, my voice cracking. "You're feeding them to whatever the hell is out there in those woods." He stood up slowly, his large frame seeming to suck all the air out of the small office. He picked up the journal, not opening it, just holding it in his big hands. His voice dropped to a near whisper, but it carried more menace than any shout. "This town has survived for over 200 years. We've survived blizzards, famines, the Depression. We survive because we understand the land we live on. We follow the rules. We keep the peace, the quiet. What you have here," he said, tapping the leather cover, "is a history of that peace, a history you are threatening." He opened a drawer in his desk and placed the sacristan's journal inside, closing it with a definitive metallic click. He was confiscating the only proof I had. "Go home, Liam," he said, his voice laced with an unmistakable threat. "Your family has been part of this town since the beginning. They understood their responsibilities. They understood the importance of silence. You've been away too long. You've forgotten how to be quiet. I suggest you remember, quickly, before you make too much noise yourself." I stumbled out of his office, completely defeated. The truth hadn't set me free. It had locked me in a much larger, more terrifying prison. It wasn't just me against some unknowable entity in the forest anymore. It was me against Havenwood Gap. And I knew with a chilling certainty that the woods weren't the only thing that demanded a sacrifice. Leaving Sheriff Collier's office was like stepping out of a building and into a vacuum. The air, the light, the very fabric of the world I knew had been altered. The mask of civility, thin as it was, had been torn away, revealing the skull beneath. There was no one to call, no authority to appeal to. The law in Havenwood Gap was not written in any book. It was etched into the silent, watchful hills, and I had just been branded a heretic. Driving back to my house, every familiar landmark seemed alien and menacing. The gentle curve of the road, the specific way a cluster of birch trees caught the afternoon light. It was all part of the stage, the beautifully crafted scenery for a play of ritual sacrifice. The few people I saw, a woman tending her garden, 2 old men on the porch of the general store, watched my car pass with an unnerving stillness. Their faces were blank, their eyes holding the placid, patient look of predators who know their prey is cornered. I was no longer Liam Henderson, son of Michael and Sarah. I was a problem, a loose thread in their tightly woven tapestry of silence and survival. My home, once a sanctuary of grief and memory, now felt like the most exposed place on earth. The moment I stepped inside, the familiar silence seemed to crawl with a new sentient malevolence. I locked the door, then bolted it. I dragged a heavy oak bookshelf in front of it, the scraping sound on the floorboards an act of desecration in the quiet house. I went from window to window, pulling the curtains shut, plunging the rooms into a gloomy, perpetual twilight. But the darkness I created offered no comfort. It only gave the shadows more room to grow. The first 24 hours were a blur of sleepless vigilance. I sat in the dark, my father's old hunting rifle across my lap, listening. Every gust of wind was an approaching footstep. Every pop of the house settling was a hand on the doorknob. My own heartbeat was a frantic, traitorous drum, too loud in the suffocating quiet. I was becoming a prisoner in my own home, my world shrinking to the confines of these four walls. The true assault, however, began not with a sound, but with a scent. I was in the kitchen trying to force down a piece of dry toast when I smelled it. A faint, floral, and achingly familiar fragrance. Jasmine and lavender, my mother's perfume. It was a scent I hadn't encountered in a decade, yet it was here, as real as the stale coffee in my mug. It was a ghost in the air, a memory made manifest. I followed the scent to her bedroom, a room I had kept closed since my return. The air inside was thick with it. I checked the vanity, her dresser drawers. The old, ornate bottle of perfume was there, but it was empty, a film of dust coating its glass stopper. The scent was not coming from the bottle. It was simply in the room. A single perfect tear of grief and terror rolled down my cheek. The thing from the woods, the entity from the sacristan's ledger, was no longer just calling from the tree line. It had found a way inside. From that moment on, the barrier between inside and outside, between memory and reality, began to dissolve. The psychological warfare escalated, becoming a meticulously orchestrated campaign to dismantle my sanity piece by piece. The attacks were subtle, insidious, designed to make me question my own perceptions. I would hear the faint, unmistakable sound of a page turning in my father's empty office. I'd find a book on his desk open to a different passage than the one I remembered. Small, trivial things that were impossible to prove, impossible to distinguish from a faulty memory or an overactive imagination. One evening, as I sat huddled in the living room, a new sound began. It was music. Faint, tinny, and distorted, it seemed to emanate from the very walls around me. It was the same indie rock song the Clarks had been playing, a ghost of their final hours, now haunting my home. I scrambled through the house, searching for the source, my heart hammering against my ribs. I checked every radio, every electronic device. Everything was unplugged. Yet the music played on, a barely audible dirge that waxed and waned, always at the edge of my hearing. It was a trophy, a sonic scalp taken from its last victims, now being paraded before me. I realized then what the sacristan had failed to fully articulate in his ledger. This entity wasn't just a predator attracted by noise, it was a connoisseur of it. It consumed sounds, hoarded them. The unnatural noises, the music, the laughter, the machinery of the modern world were not just lures, they were delicacies. The profound quiet of Havenwood Gap was not a repellent, it was a form of starvation. The community wasn't just hiding from the entity, they were systematically starving it, forcing it to focus its hunger on the rare, noisy feasts provided by outsiders. This horrifying epiphany cast the town's entire existence in a new, grotesque light. The lack of cell service wasn't a quirk of geography, it was a deliberate isolation. The town's resistance to development, their clinging to old ways, wasn't about tradition, it was a calculated survival strategy. They had cultivated a bubble of acoustic purity, a sanctuary of natural sounds, wind, birdsong, rustling leaves, to mask their presence from the starving intelligence in the woods. They had made their entire community acoustically invisible, leaving anyone who didn't know the melody of silence to stand out like a flare in the dark. The entity's intelligence was more profound and sadistic than I could have imagined. It learned, it adapted, and it seemed to take a perverse pleasure in its cruelty. A few days after the music started, the old rotary phone on the hall table, disconnected for 15 years, rang. The shrill metallic burring was so shocking in the dead quiet that I physically jumped. I stared at it, the black bakelite gleaming in the dim light. It rang again, and again, I knew I shouldn't. Rule number 3 was about voices, but this felt like an extension of the same principle. A summons. Against my better judgment, driven by a sliver of insane hope that this might be a real, human connection to the outside world, I lifted the heavy receiver. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. At first there was only static, a sound like a rushing river. Then through the static a voice emerged. My father's voice. "Don't understand, Liam. This place has rules for a reason. You can't just leave." It was a recording. A perfect phantom echo of a conversation we'd had the day I told him I was leaving for college. An argument, the last truly angry one we'd ever had. The memory was a scar on my conscience, a deep well of regret I had tried to fill for years. And this thing had dredged it up. It had plucked a moment of my deepest personal failure from the ether and was now playing it back to me through a dead telephone line. "I have to live my own life, Dad," I heard my own younger voice reply, tinny and full of arrogant defiance. "I can't suffocate here like you." I slammed the receiver down, my hand shaking uncontrollably. This was not a random echo. This was a targeted attack. It had sifted through my past, my very soul, and was weaponizing my guilt. It was telling me that I was the one who had made too much noise. I was the one who had broken the quiet. I was the one who had abandoned the pact. The symphony grew. In the following days, the house was filled with a cacophony of phantom sounds, a collage of the entity's collection. I would hear the distant cry of a baby, perhaps the Hendersons from Ohio, the ones who left their dog. I heard fragments of laughter, snippets of shouted arguments in languages I didn't recognize, the roar of a faulty engine. It was a ghost orchestra of all the victims who had made the mistake of bringing their noisy lives to this silent place. My house had become its broadcast tower, and my mind was the sole audience for its concert of stolen lives. My sanity was a cliff edge, and I was crumbling into the abyss. I couldn't eat. I couldn't think. The constant low-level acoustic assault was relentless. I was trapped in a feedback loop of terror, each new sound confirming the horrifying reality and pushing me further into isolation and madness. I was being psychologically tenderized, broken down like any other animal before the slaughter. It was during a particularly bad night, with the phantom music of the Clarks seeming to pulse in time with my own frantic heartbeat, that something in me snapped. The sheer unrelenting pressure, the hopelessness of my situation, the sadistic genius of the thing tormenting me, it all coalesced into a single blinding point of rage, a desperate, primal need to scream back into the void. If it wanted noise, I would give it noise. With a guttural cry, I scrambled to my feet. I went to the old stereo system in the corner of the living room, a relic from the 90s. My hands were steady now, fueled by a terrifying, nihilistic clarity. I found one of my old CDs, a hard rock album I hadn't listened to in years. I slid it into the tray, cranked the volume knob as far as it would go, and hit play. The explosion of sound was deafening. Distorted guitars, crashing drums, and a screaming vocalist blasted through the speakers, tearing through the house's delicate, haunted atmosphere like a cannonball. The sound was a physical force, vibrating through the floorboards, rattling the windows in their frames. It was a glorious, defiant, suicidal act of noise. And then the most terrifying thing of all happened. The instant my music began, every other phantom sound in the house stopped. The ghostly indie rock, the crying baby, the spectral arguments, the scent of my mother's perfume, all of it vanished in a microsecond. The silence they left behind was not an absence of sound, it was a presence, a vast abyssal quiet that descended upon the house, so total and so profound that the blaring rock music felt like a tiny, insignificant whisper in a dead cosmos. The woods, the house, the very air around me had stopped to listen. I stood frozen in the center of the room, the screaming music washing over me, but all I could feel was the immense focused weight of that sudden, perfect silence. It was the silence of a predator that has finally, after a long and patient hunt, heard its prey step directly into the center of its snare. I had just screamed my name into the darkness, and now it had turned its full, undivided, and ravenous attention directly upon me. The silence that answered my musical defiance was not empty. It was a dense, physical presence, a pressure against my eardrums and on my skin. It was the sound of a vast, ancient attention focusing to a single razor-sharp point. My house was that point. I was the epicenter of a stillness that felt heavier than any sound. The blaring rock music, which a moment ago had felt like an act of rebellion, now seemed like a pathetic, childish scream in the face of an indifferent God. It was a dinner bell I had rung for myself. My adrenaline-fueled rage evaporated, replaced by a cold, clear terror that was purer than anything I had ever experienced. I had to turn it off. The thought was a singular, desperate command that overrode everything else. The 10 feet separating me from the stereo felt like a mile-long gauntlet. Every instinct screamed that to move was to trigger the trap, to break the surface tension of this terrifying, watchful quiet. But to leave the music playing was to continue broadcasting my location, my defiance, my very existence to the thing that was listening. I took a step, my boot making a soft, insignificant scuff on the wooden floor. The silence didn't break. It felt like it was absorbing the sound, nullifying it. Another step, another. My breath was a silent scream in my lungs. I reached the stereo, my hand shaking so violently I could barely grasp the volume knob. I twisted it. The music cut out, and the true silence of the house rushed back in, now amplified by the contrast. It was a total, abyssal void. I had never known a quiet so complete. It was the stillness of a tomb that was waiting for its occupant. That was it. I couldn't stay. The house was no longer a cage, it was a baited trap, and I had just announced my presence to the hunter. My confrontation with Collier, the sacristan's ledger, it all faded into the background, dwarfed by the immediate primal need to flee. My mind latched onto the one symbol of freedom I had left. My car, the single road out of Havenwood Gap, was my only hope. Panic lent me a frantic, clumsy energy. I didn't pack. I didn't even think to grab the rifle. I snatched my keys from the hook by the door and my wallet from the table and bolted. I didn't bother unbarricading the front door. I fled out the back, stumbling down the porch steps and sprinting across the damp grass to my car, parked near the woodshed. The air outside was cold and still, the moon hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds. The world was rendered in shades of charcoal and ink. I fumbled with the keys, my heart trying to batter its way out of my chest, expecting at any moment to feel a hand on my shoulder or hear my mother's voice calling my name from the darkness just feet away. The car door opened with a loud metallic click that seemed to echo for miles. I threw myself inside, slammed the door and jammed the key into the ignition. The engine turned over with a roar that felt as loud and defiant as the rock music I'd played minutes before. I didn't bother with headlights. I didn't want to illuminate whatever might be watching from the trees. I slammed the car into reverse, tires spinning in the mud, and tore out of my driveway, fishtailing onto the dirt road. My only thought was the highway, the artery that would connect me back to the real world, a world of electric lights, indifferent strangers, and the beautiful, meaningless noise of civilization. The road unspooled before me in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. The familiar turns and dips, once a source of comfort, were now a labyrinth I had to navigate at a reckless speed. Trees, black and skeletal, flashed past my windows. For the first 10 minutes, a sliver of wild, desperate hope began to bloom in my chest. I was doing it. I was getting away. I passed the turn-off for the old Miller cabin, now the clerk's tomb. I passed the general store, a dark monolith in the town's sleeping center. I passed the sheriff's office. The road straightened, the final stretch that led out of the valley. It was then that the first hint of wrongness began to creep in. The road felt longer. I should have seen the turn for the main highway by now. I glanced at the car's clock. 15 minutes had passed since I left my house. It had never taken this long. I pressed harder on the accelerator, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The trees lining the road were a hypnotic, repeating pattern. A tall, lightning-scarred pine on the right, a strange bent oak on the left that looked like a kneeling man. Then I saw the pine tree again. My blood turned to ice water. It was impossible. I hadn't turned around. I hadn't stopped. Yet there it was, unmistakable in the gloom. A minute later, the kneeling oak flashed past my window. My frantic hope curdled into a nauseous dread. Was I delirious? Was the exhaustion and fear making me see things? I kept driving, my eyes scanning the darkness for the welcoming glow of the highway intersection. But instead of the highway, I saw a familiar shape loom out of the darkness ahead. A rustic, hand-carved wooden sign. It was weathered and coated in moss, its letters barely legible. "Welcome to Havenwood Gap. We ask that you respect the quiet." I slammed on the brakes, the tires screaming in protest as the car skidded to a halt just inches from the sign. I was back. I was at the entrance to town, the very point where the road from the outside world began. I had driven in a straight line for 20 minutes, yet I had somehow arrived back where I started. A single hysterical laugh escaped my lips. It wasn't a loop. A loop implies you can see the track. This was something far more insidious. The very geometry of this place was corrupt. The road itself was a lie, a conveyor belt that promised escape while only ever leading back to the center of the cage. The trap wasn't the town, it was reality itself. Havenwood Gap wasn't a location on a map. It was a pocket of diseased space, a fold in the fabric of the world that let you in but never let you out. Defeated, I rested my forehead against the steering wheel, the cheap plastic cool against my skin. The silence outside rushed in, a mocking, patient presence. It had known I would run. It had let me try. It was all part of the game. Breaking me down was a process, and this was just the next stage. The hopelessness was a physical weight, crushing the air from my lungs. There was no escape. I don't know how long I sat there, engine idling, lost in a grey fog of despair. But eventually the sound of another engine, this one labored and sputtering, cut through my stupor. I looked up. Headlights were approaching, coming into town from the direction of the highway I couldn't reach. A new player was entering the game. It was a minivan, the kind families drive, its light blue paint looking cheerful and utterly out of place against the grim backdrop of the hills. It sputtered again, coughed, and then rolled to a stop about 50 yards from my car, just past the welcome sign. I killed my engine and slumped down in my seat, peering through the windshield. A man got out, his silhouette illuminated by his own headlights. He kicked one of the tires in frustration. A woman got out of the passenger side, pulling her jacket tight against the night chill. Then the side door slid open, and a little girl, no older than 6 or 7, hopped out. She was wearing a bright pink coat and clutching a stuffed bear. Car trouble. A family. Stranded at the edge of town in the middle of the night. It was too perfect. It was a script. And I knew with a certainty that made me sick to my stomach who the next actor to walk on stage would be. Sure enough, 5 minutes later, another set of headlights appeared, this time coming from the direction of town. It was Sheriff Collier's cruiser. It pulled up alongside the stranded minivan, its red and blue lights flashing once, a predatory wink in the darkness. I watched, a helpless, horrified spectator, as the scene played out. I saw Collier get out of his car, his folksy, non-threatening posture a masterclass in deception. I could imagine his words, his calm, reassuring tone. "Engine trouble? Well, you folks are in luck. We don't have a motel, but we're a hospitable town. Got an empty cabin just up the road, fully furnished. You can stay there for the night, and I'll have someone look at your car in the morning." I saw the relief on the parents' faces. They were nodding, the father shaking Collier's hand with gratitude. The little girl in the pink coat looked at the dark woods surrounding them with a wide-eyed curiosity that broke my heart. They were lambs being led by the butcher, and they were thanking him for his kindness. Collier gestured for them to get their things. He was putting them in his cruiser. He was going to take them directly to the clerk's cabin. He was personally delivering the next tithe. Something inside me, a part of my soul I thought had been extinguished by fear, ignited. I had watched the aftermath of the clerk's disappearance. I had been tormented by the ghosts of victims past, but to watch the trap being set, to see the bait being taken by a family, by a child, it was a horror of a different magnitude. It made me a participant. My silence now was complicity. I knew what would happen. They would settle in. They would be relieved and grateful. Maybe tomorrow they'd play music on their phone. Maybe the little girl would laugh too loudly as she played in the yard. They didn't know the rules. They didn't know the quiet. And the thing in the woods was starving. My own survival suddenly seemed insignificant, a petty concern in the face of this grotesque, repeating tragedy. My fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in my stomach, but it was now overshadowed by a burning, desperate imperative. I couldn't let it happen. I couldn't let that little girl's laughter be the next ghost to haunt these hills. I watched Collier's cruiser pull away, heading up the road toward the Miller-Clark cabin. I knew what I had to do. It was a suicidal, insane impulse, but it was the only human one I had left. I had to warn them. I started my car and followed, keeping my distance. I parked at the entrance to my own driveway and got out, my legs unsteady beneath me. I could see the lights on in the Clark's cabin now. A warm, inviting yellow glow that was the most horrifying thing I had ever seen. I walked toward it, my heart a slow, heavy drum of doom. As I got closer, I saw the front door. It was closed, but I just knew, what I would find. I crept through the trees to the edge of their yard. The family was inside. I could see their silhouettes moving past the windows. Then, I saw the front door handle turn. The door swung open. A man, the father, stepped out onto the porch, looked up at the starless sky and then went back inside, leaving the door standing wide open to the night. Rule number 4, if you find a door to your house standing open, do not enter. He had broken the rule without even knowing it existed. He had left the door open. He had issued the invitation. And I, standing at the edge of the woods, knew that the only way to save them was to break the rule myself. I had to enter that cabin. I had to cross that threshold. It was a choice between my own damnation and their survival. Taking a deep, ragged breath, I stepped out of the shadows and began to walk across the yard, toward the gaping black rectangle of the open door. Every step I took across the dew-slicked grass of the Clark's former yard was a negotiation with my own terror. The open door was not just an entrance. It was a verdict, a threshold, between the world of the hunted and the world of the damned. The warm yellow light spilling from it felt like a physical barrier, a membrane of false hope I had to push through. The house was silent. There were no sounds of a happy family settling in for the night, no television murmuring, no childish laughter. There was only the low ambient hum of the woods, a sound I now understood to be the resting breath of a predator. I reached the porch steps. The wood was soft and rotten under my boots. My hand found the railing, and the splintery texture grounded me for a single lucid moment. I was about to break the most important rule. I was about to walk, willingly, into the open mouth of the trap. But the image of the little girl in the bright pink coat, clutching her stuffed bear, was burned into my mind. Her life was worth more than my sanity, more than my soul. Before I cross this threshold, before the door swings shut behind me, I need you to answer me. I need you to write it in the comments below. After everything you've heard, what is the terrible final truth of Havenwood Gap? What unspeakable secret allows this town to persist in the heart of this ancient hunger? Subscribe to this channel, because you are about to become the last witness. The silence is about to be broken forever. My hand left the railing. I climbed the 3 steps, each one a final, weighty decision. I paused at the doorway, peering into the living room. The scene within was bizarrely, horrifyingly normal. The father was sitting on the couch, reading a pamphlet of some kind. The mother was in the kitchenette, pouring a glass of water, and the little girl was on the floor, quietly arranging a set of toy blocks. None of them looked up. None of them acknowledged my presence in the doorway. They moved with a slow, placid grace, like figures in a dream. "Get out," I rasped, my voice a dry, cracking thing. "You have to get out of here. Now." The father slowly raised his head, his eyes unfocused. He gave me a gentle, beatific smile. "It's all right," he said, his voice soft and strangely melodic. "The sheriff said we'd be safe here. The quiet is so peaceful." The word quiet from his lips was a desecration. A chill, deeper than any I had felt before, snaked its way up my spine. This wasn't relief. This was enchantment. They weren't just unafraid. They were pacified. "It's not safe," I yelled, finally stepping over the threshold. The air inside the cabin was cold and still, and carried the faint, cloying scent of damp earth and something vaguely metallic, like old blood. "This place is a trap. You have to listen to me. As soon as my second foot touched the floorboards inside, the front door swung shut behind me with a solid, definitive thud. The lock clicked with the finality of a coffin lid being nailed down, and then they emerged. They didn't come from a secret door or a hidden panel. They simply stepped out of the shadows that clung to the corners of the room. Sheriff Collier was first, his face an unreadable mask of weary authority. Then Mr. Abernathy, his ancient eyes holding a look of profound, almost paternal disappointment. And behind them others. Martha from the general store, the town clerk, a dozen familiar faces, all of them silent, all of them watching me. Their expressions were not of malice or anger. They were calm, resigned. They were a congregation that had just witnessed the completion of a sacred rite. The tourist family on the couch didn't react. They remained in their placid trance, puppets whose strings had been temporarily dropped. "Liam," Mr. Abernathy said, his voice a gravelly rumble that seemed to be the only sound the universe would permit. "You should not have come here." "I had to," I snarled, my fear and confusion boiling over into a desperate rage. "You were going to feed them to it, that little girl." Collier let out a long, tired sigh. "Son, you still don't understand, do you? They were never the meal, they were just the dinner bell." My mind reeled, unable to process the words. "What are you talking about? The open door, the noise they would have made." "The tithe is not always about consumption," Abernathy said, taking a slow step forward. He moved with the unhurried patience of a man who has all the time in the world. "Sometimes it is about recruitment, about restoring balance." He gestured around the small cabin, at the walls, the floor, the very air itself. "This entity, this presence in the woods, it is ancient. We do not command it. We have an accord, a covenant that has sustained this town since its founding. We offer it a sanctuary of quiet, a reprieve from the painful, chaotic noise of your world. In exchange, it offers us prosperity, long life, peace. By feeding it, people," I spat. "By providing it with anchors," Abernathy corrected, his voice taking on the tone of a patient teacher. "Outsiders, with their noise and their disbelief, create a resonance that draws the entity's attention. They become a focal point for its hunger, a sacrifice that satisfies it for a time and leaves the rest of us in our sanctified quiet. But the pact requires more than just sacrifices, Liam. It requires a gatekeeper, a shepherd for the flock." He stopped directly in front of me. His pale blue eyes seemed to look straight through me, into the deepest, most terrified corners of my soul. "Your family, the Hendersons, they were one of the founding lines. But they were special. They were not just residents. Their blood is bound to this land, to the pact itself. They were the original hosts, the primary anchor that holds the entity's attention in a stable, predictable way. For generations, a Henderson has lived in that house on the ridge, serving as the town's silent guardian. Their presence reinforces the pact, focuses the entity, and makes the necessary tithes a clean, simple affair." Every word was a nail driving the truth into my heart. I looked from Abernathy's weathered face to Collier's grim resolve, and I finally understood. "My parents," I whispered, the words barely audible. "Their crash was an unfortunate accident," Collier said, though his tone held no conviction. "But their absence created a void. The pact began to weaken. The entity grew restless, its attention wandering. The whispers from the woods grew more frequent. The quiet was becoming unstable. We were all at risk." Abernathy placed a cool, dry hand on my shoulder. The contact was electric, a current of horrifying comprehension shocking me into stillness. "Your departure 10 years ago was the first wound, Liam. Your parents' death was the second. Your return was a necessity. We needed a Henderson back in that house. We needed to reseal the pact." The final, terrible piece of the puzzle slotted into place. The truth, when it came, was not a sudden revelation, but a slow, cold dread that filled every empty space inside me. "The family," I said, looking at the placid, smiling people on the couch. "They weren't for it. They were for me." Abernathy nodded slowly, a flicker of something like pride in his ancient eyes. "They were the catalyst. The bait, yes, but not for the creature. For you. We knew your conscience, your goodness, The part of you that has not yet been worn away by the world would not allow you to let them be harmed. We knew you would come, we knew you would cross the threshold, and in doing so, you would make a choice. You would choose to engage, to accept your responsibility, to become the new host. I stumbled backward, my legs giving way. I fell into a chair, the world tilting around me. I was not the victim of the monster in the woods. I was its designated keeper. My whole life, my return, my grief, it had all been a long, elaborate process of grooming me for this position. The house was not my inheritance, it was my post, my eternal prison. As if summoned by my understanding, the atmosphere in the cabin changed. The air grew heavy, thick, and intensely cold. A low, subsonic hum vibrated up from the floorboards, a sound felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. The yellow light from the lamps seemed to dim and bend at the edges, as if being consumed by the encroaching shadows. The presence of the entity was no longer a suspicion, it was a certainty. It was here in the room with us, its vast, silent attention a crushing weight. It had come to witness my investiture. I looked at the window, and the blackness outside was no longer just the absence of light. It was a solid, watching presence. The woods were looking in. My role was not to be the sacrifice. My role was to provide them, to be the welcoming neighbor, to deliver the basket with the rules, to be the one who offers the poisoned hospitality of Havenwood Gap, to ensure that when the pact demanded a tithe, there was a loud, naive, disbelieving outsider ready to pay the price. The Clarks had been the sacrifice necessary to draw me back into the town's secrets. This family was the sacrifice necessary to seal my place within them. The fight drained out of me, replaced by a vast, empty despair. There was no escape. There never had been. My future was a flat circle, a repeating nightmare in which I was a central, unchangeable cog. The story ends here, but my life does not. I am writing this from my father's desk, in the quiet of the house on the ridge. Months have passed. The tourist family? They moved on, of course. Sheriff Collier told me their minivan was fixed, and they left in the middle of the night, grateful for the town's generosity. I know their screams, their voices, their daughter's laughter have now joined the silent chorus that the entity keeps as its private symphony. Sometimes on a quiet night, I think I can hear them. I don't fight it anymore. The townspeople treat me with a quiet, solemn respect now. I am a part of the secret. I am a pillar of the community. I have accepted my inheritance. I can see a new car coming up the road. It's an expensive sedan with out-of-state plates. It's slowing down, the driver looking with interest at the now empty cabin at the end of the road, the one with the fresh coat of paint and the for sale sign that went up last week. I stand up from my desk and walk to the front porch. A welcome basket is sitting there, prepared by Martha from the general store. It feels light in my hands. I can feel the weight of the single folded piece of paper inside. I descend the steps, a calm, practiced smile on my face. I live in a small community in the Appalachian hills. We have rules for outsiders here. It's my job to make sure they learn them, and eventually that they break them.